Hi, I'm attorney Gregory Dell, and I'm here with attorney Cesar Gavidia. And Cesar, today I want to discuss is how do disability insurance companies manipulate the occupational duties or description of what a disability claimant was doing at the time they were disabled? And to a person watching this video, it may say, what do you mean, how are they manipulating my duties? But other than medical information and proving what your disability is, the occupational description and what those duties were that you were doing are essential in terms of getting your claim approved. And the manner in which your duties are presented can be the difference in whether or not you can do that job or not. But if you don't agree on what the job was, there's a big problem. And unfortunately, as disability lawyers, we see this on a daily basis where the occupational description is manipulated. So, why, Caesar, and how do the disability insurance companies manipulate the occupational description?
Well, one of the first things that they'll do when they begin processing a disability claim is that, throughout that disability application, initial application that you're completing, they're going to ask you about your occupational duties. But the question is how close attention or how much real weight do they give to those duties that you're describing to them? Or maybe you're not even completing that small section that they're giving you to describe your occupational duties, but attaching a very descriptive list of your occupational duties. Wouldn't it be fair and wouldn't logic follow that they would pay really close attention? Because that is the critical question in this disability policies. Are you able to perform the substantial material duties of your occupation, if not for this medical issue that you're suffering, right? So one of the ways that they'll manipulate or that they kind of arbitrarily view your occupation is instead of focusing in on each of those critical duties, they kind of do this assessment of your job or your occupation, so to speak, and they try to just lump it into a category, a physical demand category. All right, so what they're doing is they're saying, okay, this occupation where this person's a software engineer, how is it performed in a kind of global aspect? Is it performed, at a desk with, computers and where they're primarily sitting for extended periods of time? Because if that's the case, they're going to consider that occupation primarily sedentary, right? They may consider, so what they do is they basically have this, what they call Dictionary of Occupational Titles that they refer to, that will give them these physical demand categories for occupations or your occupation or occupations that are close to what you are performing, what your occupation is. So to me, that's very manipulative because they're not really focusing or considering your occupational duties. And when you read that definition of disability in that disability policy, what it says is occupational duties, right? Your ability to perform your occupational duties. It doesn't talk about physical demand categories usually. It doesn't talk about, that they can categorize it in a certain way. Now they're getting smart, and I've seen some disability plans that have been, defining your occupational duties as how it's described or defined in that Dictionary of Occupational Titles, and that's kind of allowing them to categorize your occupation into one of these physical demand categories. But many policies don't have that.
And Caesar, on our website, as you know, we've gone through to great lengths to talk about almost every major occupation that's out there because we've represented claimants throughout the entire country in every occupational field. It's rare that someone ever calls us and says, hey, I do this job, and we're like, what is that? We've done every single claim, and we've seen how the disability insurance companies interpret those specific occupations. And I encourage people to go to those pages on our website and search specific to your occupation because you're going to find a lot of helpful information there. You're going to find articles and cases and other cases, summaries that we've written that we've resolved where we talk about how these disability insurance companies interpret and look at your specific occupation. And having that knowledge is going to put you in a better place to be able to get your claim approved. But Cesar, why, as you as an attorney, when you're representing a claimant, is it super important for you to really understand what that person was doing at their job.
Because that, along with the medical support you have, the occupational duties that you're performing at the time that you become disabled is the critical question and the critical issue in the disability claim. What are your occupational duties? What is your disability, or what is the medical condition that's causing you to have these limitations that specifically prevent you from performing those occupational duties? So it's the foundational question of the whole disability claim. So it's really critical to understand what those occupational duties are, to be very descriptive about what those occupational duties are, about the demand, both physical and, we so often forget about the cognitive requirements of some of these occupational duties, right? I mean, I read so many disability insurance denial letters, and there's no mention ever. I mean, I can tell you probably 98% of disability insurance denial letters, I never see any reference to the cognitive demands, the intellectual demands of an occupation or the occupational duties. It's always focusing on the physical, when so many disabilities affect the cognitive and the mental demands of being able to perform that occupation.
Well, let's talk about those cognitive, along the lines of those subjective complaints, basically, is what you're saying. The cognitive difficulties, the complaints of pain, your inability to focus. How do those get excluded or not even considered when the disability insurance company is talking about these occupational classifications? And if you can define what those are, because you mentioned them, but you haven't described what those categories are.
So those categories would be, starting from the sedentary one, which means basically a job that requires minimal physical effort, right? It's an occupation that's primarily, performed in a sitting position. Then you go up through a category of light, medium, and heavy, so your occupation can fall into any one of those categories depending on how the insurance company decides to define your occupation or analyze your occupation. And it's really critical to have a really strong understanding of what your occupational requirements are. Because when we start getting into this nuance and this question of when the insurance company is looking at your occupation versus your job, and people get this often confused. They think, well, I have to travel all over the country, all over the state for my occupation. I'm in my car driving for X number of hours. Well, when the insurance company is looking at your occupation and how it's performed, maybe how it's done on a national scale isn't done driving, for hours in a car, or isn't required to, lift and carry a bunch of boxes or materials or documents with you, or presentation materials or anything like that with you. And those may be the things that you have significant problems in. And if the insurance company is basically looking at your occupation as it's performed in a national setting, and that's not one of those critical or important aspects of that occupation, they're going to likely deny the claim.
And Cesar, when you were talking about they take out the human component of it, and how often do we see we're representing an accountant, a lawyer, a business consultant, and they basically say, well, we did a vocational consultant report. Your occupation is deemed sedentary. If you can sit for more than 6 hours, you can do your job. Yeah. Well, let's just use lawyers because we know that as good as anything because we're both lawyers. Well, I guess if the only job was for us to be able to sit, then we would put out resumes and say, if you can sit for 6 hours, come do the job. And yet, as ridiculous as that sounds, that's how much they minimize the occupational duties. And then they send it off to a doctor for a review. They'll do their own in-house occupational review, ignoring everything that the claimant sent them. And they'll say, the occupation requires 6 hours or more per day of sitting. Can the claimant do it? And you and I were talking about this before. What do the in-house doctors even ask questions about what the claimant's doing? Or do they even know half the time what the claimant was doing?
No, they generally don't, right? So all they're opining is in basically the physical functional limitations that this insured may have, based on their scant review of their medical records, right? Never having examined the insured, basically just looking through this material. They often try to reach out to the doctor, but people think, oh, they were reaching out to my doctor, so so as to try to get a better sense of my physical, my disability, my limitations. No, they're reaching out to your doctor to try to flip them, to try to basically get them to agree to their opinions. And they battle with them. I saw in a recent note in a claim file that I was reviewing that that the in-house peer review doctor actually noted that the doctor and he continued to disagree. So clearly the point of that phone call wasn't to try to get a better assessment of the insured's physical functional limitations or of his symptoms or of the duration of them or of anything, of this treatment. None of that. It was just to try to convince that doctor that they're not disabled. And to me, that is one of the most disingenuous things a disability insurance company and their doctors can do.
Right, and how with the doctors not even asking half the time what the claimant did, even if they had a title, they should be asking, well, what were the duties? I mean, you just gave me a title. A title doesn't describe what a person does. Even in the world of attorney, there's so many different kinds of attorneys and different skills required. You start off with a software developer. The software developers don't all perform their duties the same way. Managers don't do things the same way. So every type of occupation has different manners in which it's performed, and one could be a sedentary type performance of the job, and another one could be light duty, medium duty, or heavy duty. So it's a very, very important factor when presenting your disability claim. And Cesar, when someone's going to present their occupation, some of the things that a person should be aware of is there's usually always an employer statement that's provided. There's often a job description, but very often the job description, especially for someone who's been at a company, it doesn't match what the person was actually doing. Sometimes they're at a company 5, 10, 15 years. Now they have the job of 4 people. And that job description might have been in their personnel file when they started. So, you can't rely on that. But what are some of the other pieces of evidence that you like to obtain? And I know it's specific to every occupation because we have strategies we use for all the different occupations, but what are some other common things that you could think of that you would suggest to a claimant to present to help prove what their occupational duties were?
Well, I think it always starts with a really comprehensive and exhaustive description of the occupational duties. Okay, that's always basically the foundation of that. Then, of course, as you mentioned, they're going to definitely reach out to your employer. And what the employer is going to do, they'll reach somebody in the human resources department most likely, right? They're not going to reach out to your direct supervisor or to a coworker of yours that works side by side with you for the past 10 years. What they're going to do is they're going to reach out to someone in human resources. Probably someone that you've talked to 2 or 3 times and probably relating to this issue of you going out on disability, right? And they're going to ask them, do you have a job description for this employee? And they're going to provide a job description. And it's going to be a very generalized job description. It's going to be basically that description which is given out when they're looking or seeking somebody for that position, right? One of those things you'll find on job search websites or something like that these corporations put out. So what I always think is really helpful, and I've been able to do it in a few cases, is I've had supervisors, direct supervisors, or people that worked with them provide an additional description of the occupation and the occupational duties and what they personally witnessed and can testify to what this occupation was. The other thing I do, and this kind of comes from our years of working as litigators and trial lawyers, is we're always looking for experts, right? We're always looking for consultants. So in disability insurance cases, and this is just coming from a lot of our experience with individual disability claims, I've pulled experts in the field. And for example, I had a client who was an anesthesiologist in a case, right? And what I did is I found an expert who was an anesthesiologist, a professor at Stanford University, who provided me a report and basically expert testimony describing the occupational duties of an anesthesiologist. Now you would think, well, why can't that just come from the insured themselves? It can, but this is additional evidence because this is going to show you how important some of these critical important duties are, right? So for example, why would it be important for an anesthesiologist to be able to lift a person of a certain weight when they're in the operating room? You've got people around you to do it. But as this other anesthesiologist had testified in our case, it's important because they have to be able to be a part of the transfer. If being an anesthesiologist is a very physical, demanding kind of occupation and job in and of itself, and they have to be able to react at a moment's notice when something's going wrong in that OR.
Right. And I've done other things in the sense of I've asked the claimants, give us your calendar for whatever you were doing. If you were a lawyer, give us your client list, just showing the types of cases. And when you talked about a comprehensive analysis, you could write a 5-10 page summary of, this is what a typical day was like, to the point where when the claims person looks at it, they go, this was like nonstop. This was, putting out one fire after another. This was tons of responsibility, supervising these people or having to call this person or travel here or on this phone call or researching this issue. And you realize that it's a nonstop cycle of work. I mean, everyone who's in their job, they go in and they want to accomplish 5 things that day. Maybe they get 2 done because 8 other things popped up in that day that they didn't know. So you can go to your colleagues and bring in other statements, like you said. You can bring in case studies of other things in the environment. You can show what the competitors do and how they describe the job. The more you can put in about the occupation, the better. And the bottom line is, don't rely on the what you started with, which was the little tiny space that says, what's your occupation? And then says, how often do you have to sit? How long do you have to stand? Do you have to reach? Do you have to bend? Do you have to carry 5 pounds? Because all of that's nonsense. It's not the reality of how the job was. And you really need to paint the real picture of what the job is, because if your claim gets denied, you want to be able to present to the judge, look at this massive job responsibilities that were there, and how do you compare 100 pages of information to 3 lines that says claimant can sit for 6 hours a day. And that's the bottom line, is to take that reasonable approach. So we encourage you to reach out to any of our lawyers, whether it's Cesar, myself, or any other lawyers at our firm. We're always going to provide you with a free initial consultation to review your claim. We're available to represent you all over the country. Again, we welcome you to explore our website. We make it very easy for you to search by your occupation or your disability company or your medical condition, and you're going to find a lot of information. You can, of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel below, because we put out multiple videos every week where we like to offer what we believe are helpful tips to educate you about the disability process and hopefully give you one nugget of information that you could take that does something to help you stay on claim or get you back on claim if you've been denied. So we'll be here when you need us, and we look forward to the opportunity to speak with you in the future.